Hello, you're listening to the latest season of the COVID Inquiry podcast. This week, Nicola is joined by Lorelei King, actor, screenwriter, narrator, and most pertinently, a member of the COVID-19 Bereaved Families for Justice group. Together, they're going to reflect on how the recent hearings went and look forward to the next few days of evidence. Please note, some listeners may find the contents of this podcast distressing.
Hello everyone, I am Nicola Brook from Broudie, Canter solicitors, and I am responsible for the day-to-day management of our work on the COVID inquiry on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice UK, and this is our final podcast for Module 2. As always, my co-host today is Lorelei King, who is a member of COVID Bereaved Families, having lost her husband. Joining us on the panel today are 3 familiar names and 1 new one. So returning today is Sammie McFarland from Long COVID Kids, Enda McGarrity from PA Duffy, who act on behalf of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice Northern Ireland, and Amos Waldman, who is also a member of COVID Bereaved Families for Justice. Joining us for the first time today is Sam Jacobs, who is counsel for the Trade Union Congress, and he had the opportunity to question Rishi Sunak this week and also to make a closing statement. Welcome, everyone.
Good morning, all, and thank you so much for joining us. As always, we're just so grateful that you take the time. The last week of Module 2 has been quite a ride. We had one witness this week, the current Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, and then we had closing submissions from everyone, including the Treasury and Cabinet Office, which I wouldn't mind talking about later. Should we start with Rishi Sunak then? I think my impressions of him I was in the hearing room, were just how slippery he was, how his technique seemed to be that he was just going to drone us into submission, utterly snoozeworthy, incapable of giving a straight answer. When I looked at the notes I took, there were words like boring, evading, not remembering, won't give a straight answer. And I just wondered if I could just come to each of you for what your thoughts were about him. Should we start with our newbie, Sam?
Sure thing. Well, first of all, I'm very happy to be joining you, and thanks for inviting me. Lorelei, that's obviously right as an observation. He certainly was slippery. And one thing I have noticed, particularly over the last couple of weeks, is I think the inquiry, and I suspect the chair in particular, is quite sensitive to some of the noise outside of the inquiry, and is increasingly conscious of a desire not to appear political, impossible though it is to avoid highly political topics. And I think one way that has manifested itself is Hugo Keith taking a slightly softer approach to controlling witnesses. It's certainly my impression that in weeks gone past, he has been quite happy to stop witnesses in their tracks and say, answer the question in precisely in that way, and almost in slightly patronizing tones. So if you're not going to answer the question, I'm going to restate it and ask you to answer the question. More recently, the chair has stopped him doing that, and I can't quite recall with which witness it was. It may have been Matt Hancock, but on 2 occasions in close succession, he stopped the witness and said, answer the question. And the chair has said, let the witness answer. And I think rightly or wrongly, Hugo Keith has taken his steer from that and reverted to a default position of letting the witness answer, quote unquote, even if the answer is a complete non-answer. And I found that frustrating. But what I would also say is that I suspect everyone's reflection is that the questions weren't being answered. And I think that probably speaks volumes, and in a sense is just as powerful as a truthful answer, if not more damning.
I agree, Sam. It's very frustrating for us because and thank you for raising that point about her going easier on the witnesses, because in recent weeks as well, I think since the former Prime Minister Boris Johnson came, and maybe with Matt Hancock, the bereaved who often attend the inquiry. I know, Sammie, you're there. I see you and members of your group there, as well as members of our group. And we And Amos, I think you'll agree, we're pushed back further and further and further. Just physically, we've been removed. So it's as though, and removed from the room itself in recent demonstration. And I feel like our needs are being pushed further away. Our loved ones needed protection, but they're being protected. And I agree with you about Lady Hallett's question. Sam, there was one thing particularly about Sunak I wanted to ask you about. I noticed when he was being questioned, he talked about the opening of shops, and he seems to be rewriting history a bit. He seemed to be wanting to steer away from it being about the economy. And he was saying, like he was noble, he wanted to open the shops because the low paid were vulnerable, and he wanted to ensure that, I don't know, that they could keep earning. And I just thought, this is just like, he considers them, as he considers the elderly, dispensable. Why could he not instead have given them financial support? And I just wondered if you had any thoughts about this aspect of his testimony.
I do have thoughts about that. I think it's completely contrived, frankly, to repeatedly state that they were really driven by this concern of unequal impact in certain professions. Sectors being closed did have a disproportionate impact on those on lower incomes. So in a sense, it's correct. But we also know that Rishi Sunak, for proper reasons in a sense, was desperately keen on getting the economy going. And what sort of gives away the lie is the point you raise, which is if it was genuinely driven by concern as to unequal impact, then the concern would not only be letting people work, it would be letting people work and work safely. But there wasn't that at all. And the lack of the approach to financial support for those, particularly on lower incomes, who were needing to self-isolate, is just the most telling example of that. And there's voluminous evidence to the effect that the Treasury, but Rishi Sunak in particular, was vehemently opposed to providing any financial support, any significant financial support, including to those on lower incomes. So I have to say, from my perspective, the avowed concern for equaling the impact of closing certain sectors is not one that I buy, I have to say.
Thank you. And I want to ask our other lawyers in a minute. But first, Sammie and Amos, could I, if you were there or if you listened to his testimony, I wonder how it felt to you. I did notice being in the room that when the WhatsApp messages came up, there was actual laughter. The public gallery broke out into laughter as he claimed that, not to know what happened to them. Sammie, if I could come to you first, what did you make of his testimony that day?
I just wasn't really sure why he was there, because he didn't answer any of the questions that were asked. And, we're all taxpayers. I'm not entirely sure how much the inquiry is costing, but I'm certain that, Rishi's day could have been spent more effectively than it was. And it was a missed opportunity. We all deserve answers. Those answers were lacking. And I think I saw somebody post on Twitter that they'd counted 29 times that he said that he could not recall. I have long COVID. I have cognitive impairment from catching the virus. And I could recall better what happened in the pandemic. And that makes me concerned if our leader can't recall facts that happened at a time where he had a major role to play. And I thought it was really disrespectful to those of us representing the communities of bereaved and people with long COVID to come into the room and to think that it was okay to not recall the information and not give us the answers that we have waited so long to hear.
Yeah, I agree. That kind of cognitive impairment would be worrying in a prime minister, except my view is that it's utterly contrived. And I know I'm not the only one. Amos, what did you make of him as a witness?
Yeah, I thought he was woeful, really, as you say. I mean, we were hoping rather than expecting that the politicians would at least contribute to this procedure. It was galling, really, to hear them say at the outset that they're here to to do that, to participate in the process, to be frank, to be transparent. These words that we've heard all along, and then all of them and all of the, the key figures in the cabinet we've heard from so far have been anything but, and they've all had their own sort of styles, whether it's Michael Gove, who just kept on going off tangents and trying to talk the time down, and Boris Johnson sort of feigning this role that he tried, and then obviously when it came to cross-examination showed his real self really when he was asked questions from the core participants. And then again, as Boris Johnson had done, as you say, with the WhatsApps initially, it was just laughable. And from, it was frustrating in a way to see, as Sam was saying before, the strength of the questioning, and to really see him say, come on, are you really suggesting that you don't have these WhatsApps anymore? What efforts have you made to retrieve it? It just wasn't there, was it? And these were, given that was the way the questioning started and sort of set the tone, that more could have been made of that. And because they didn't reflect, they were still stuck in defensive. We haven't really done anything wrong. I mean, Sunak was repeated, he was still talking about it, having heard the evidence, and he has obviously, and this, I certainly felt looking at his evidence, that he was tailoring it to the other evidence. He was sort of talking about some SAGE meetings and some minutes that he could remember. Yet, when it came to key things that he was asked about, like, were you present at this? Do you remember this meeting? And he'd say, no, I can't remember. So it was pretty selective, but he was still, having heard the evidence and the learning so far, you'd have thought that some of the politicians would have reflected and said, actually, having heard this evidence, actually, we were wrong about this. And they didn't really, and they were making concessions that they thought didn't matter, like Johnson sort of making concessions that, in his view, didn't contribute to any deaths or injuries. And they were still running this annoying story, him saying, it's really hard. These decisions were really hard, balancing the economy against the health. And to some extent, Hugo Keith allowed him to do that. Whereas what most people who've been watching the inquiry now know, and we knew as people, people involved in it, that it isn't a health versus wealth situation, is it? And as many of the witnesses have pointed out, that if you get on top of the pandemic early, you get the best of both worlds. So we ended up with the worst death loss, one of the worst in the world, and one of the worst financial hits. So it was really galling. And then, as you said, the eat out to health out, claiming that it was okay because the environments were safe, sending people out, when we know that there's so much anecdotal evidence, and there's pretty good evidence as well, isn't there, from Warwick that it did contribute in a meaningful way to infections, and just sent the wrong message out at the time. People should have been more cautious, and they knew what we were going to get, a second wave. So it was difficult to hear. And I think with Sunak, it was sort of a bit of an anticlimax, because with Johnson, it was 2 days, and you felt that at least he showed his real self. He had to answer some tricky questions. And I think people just thought, yeah, that's Boris Johnson. But with Sunak, because it was just, I don't know, as you say, waffle bore, it was just, I don't know, it's just, he left there and you just kind of thought, yeah, as Sammie said, really, what's the point?
Yeah, I agree with you. The politicians seem to start with this kind of pro forma apology, and they say they're happy about the inquiry and that we need to learn from it. I mean, with Sunak, my personal feeling was, and with some of the others, well, they didn't seem to learn from the first wave going into the second. But Enda, what did you make of him as a witness? Any use, or what came out of that for you?
Not an awful lot, Lorelei, to be honest. I share everyone's frustration with how he was handled. Someone quipped to me as we were leaving the hearing centre that they wonder, will he remember how to get home? Because he didn't seem to recall much throughout his evidence. One of the striking points was his explanation around eat out to help out, and really trying to portray this as a smaller measure within a broader package of measures, and therefore there was no real need to go and start asking around all the scientists for their opinion. He said that anyone who wanted to raise an issue had an opportunity to do it over, I think it was a period of 4 to 6 weeks or something in that region, and no one did. Well, there's a good reason for that, and that's that he made a concerted effort to restrict the potential for any dissenting voices arising. So him saying that, and the lack of challenge that that followed was quite frustrating.
Nicola, and how about you, Rishi Sunak, and particularly Eat Out to Help Out? I'm happy to talk about that if you would like to.
In one word, gaslighting. In many more words, it was striking how these monumental, once-in-a-lifetime key decisions were being taken, and he couldn't remember the conversations leading up to them. Yet, when it suited, he was able to quote the exact GDP percentage points, the exact amount of money that was spent, the exact date, that only when it suited, mind you. And yet, when asked about the likes of the Marcus Rashford scheme to ensure kids got fed outside of school times, he couldn't even remember what he thought about it at the time. And that for me was just it. Gaslighting is the only word I can come up with, because it was really, really striking. And one of the frustrating things about this process is the way we have to submit questions in advance. And we are very restricted on what we can do on our feet. So with the likes of Eat Out to Help Out, I wanted to know, okay, so you didn't ask for the expert advice from the scientists. If they had come to you and said, this is a bad idea, would you have stopped it? Or would you have ploughed ahead with it? Or would you have come up with another way of making sure these now vulnerable people who you supposedly want to protect all along because they're in low wages, would you have come up with another way to protect them? Oh, hang on a minute. Probably not, because Boris Johnson doesn't want any of this swear word of talking to the TUC about it.
Yeah, I'm just going to circle back for a second to Marcus Rashford. I think that was Professor Thomas for Femho who asked him about that. And the one thing that really struck me was when he brought up the thing about talking about the poor and this free meals plan and not wanting freeloaders. And he would not even get a straight answer. He denied saying that, or didn't even go as far as denying. And Professor Thomas said something like, but you would agree it was reprehensible if someone said that. He would not even just say, yeah, that's reprehensible. It really struck me that. Sam, what was your views on that, the Eat Out to Help Out testimony?
It was extraordinary. I mean, it was superficially, if I may say so, clever and attractive in the sense that what he said was the government, with scientific support, had already agreed an approach of reopening in stages, including reopening hospitality. And so Eat Out to Help Out was all effectively part of a pre-approved package. But that's only superficially attractive, because actually when one sort of stops and thinks about it, it's complete nonsense. Firstly, because actually what the scientific advice was on this sort of proposed roadmap is that it was on the very outer edges of riskiness. So actually, the scientists were already giving warnings as to the government approach. But more significantly, Eat Out to Help Out primarily was a public health messaging device. And reopening hospitality with a message of caution is one thing. Reopening, and that is what was approved and discussed with the scientists. Reopening hospitality with a message of it is now your national duty to eat out with friends and family. And in fact, it's so important, we're going to do something utterly unprecedented, and we're going to pay for half of your meal. No matter how many people go on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, for these 4 weeks, we're going to pay for half of your meal, or whatever the financial arrangement was. So as a public messaging device, it was so different to what had been discussed weeks previously with the scientists. I mean, as one witness, I can't remember which witness it was, as one witness described it, it was taking your foot off the brake is one thing, but putting your foot on the accelerator is something else. And that sort of really encapsulates it. And, the honest answer would be that they didn't ask the scientists because they knew precisely what the scientists would say. And frankly, I don't think they cared all that much at that stage.
He said something interesting that I don't think I've heard any of the other witnesses say, which he said he was worried about over compliance with restrictions. And it was extraordinary. I'd never heard this concept before. He was worried people were obeying too much, and perhaps that would be to the harm of the economy.
I just thought that he was really intent on celebrating the wins of his scheme and ignoring the consequences. And as pretty much throughout the entire pandemic, what we've seen is that there's been no holistic approach. Everything's been considered in isolation.
As Sammie was saying, for people suffering from long COVID, but also for bereaved families, and actually, we don't hold it against people going and doing it because they were told to do it by the government and encouraged to do so. But as someone who'd lost someone very early, I remember thinking at the time, and what friends were going, and I was asked this the other day, did you use it? I said no, because I was still quite traumatized by what had happened and worried. And, we know that it didn't really work financially because people only went on those 3 days and not other days. It increased infections. And, as I think it was Angela McLean, who said, what would you have said if you were asked about it? And she said, there are other ways that companies can be helped.
Yeah, I think for those of us, Amos, who lost our loved ones in the first wave, I think it was very hard, the whole lead out, to help out, because our friends who lost people in the second wave, just knowing that maybe it didn't have to happen that way. One more little point I remembered about Rishi Sunak. He kept talking about this thing about the guidance, that the restaurants that were participating had to follow this guidance. And it seared in my mind his photo op, maskless, gloveless, serving food, breathing over it, laughing over it, talking over it. And I thought, was that in the guidance? Was he following the guidance himself? It was horrible. Shall we move on to closing submissions? I have to say, I thought Anna Morris, who spoke for the COVID Bereaved Families for Justice, Casey Anna, she was absolutely brilliant. She was up first of the CPs. Nicola, you must have been proud. She was amazing, right?
Very proud, particularly because she was only told last minute that she was going to be responsible for delivering our closing speech. Obviously, it's a team effort in getting the closing speech together. But poor Pete had been struck down with 2 compressed discs in his neck, which meant he was unable to be there. But she did a stellar job. And what was really quite striking was that all 4 bereaved groups that day were all represented by women delivering these powerful speeches on behalf of their groups. And as a woman in law, it hasn't been that way for a long, long time. And so just personally for me, that was a proud moment.
It's the women among us, we all noticed that. I noticed on the chat boards, people were buzzing with that news. It was amazing. And Enda, Ms. Campbell, who she was also incredibly strong in her closing submissions, talking about how Northern Ireland hadn't had a presence when decisions were being made that affected them. You must have been proud too.
Absolutely. It was really the culmination of really 11 weeks of with 9 weeks of actual sitting dates in the hearing, but the culmination of a lot of work leading up to that point. And funny enough, from the opening statement, it really mirrored what we were saying there. So, there was what we thought would come out in the evidence actually did to a large extent. And one of the most interesting points in it was her discussion around the real-time flip-flop by Johnson and his evidence. So we know that throughout Module 2, there's been a theme of flip-flop, trolleying, oscillation, whatever you want to call it. Basically, that Johnson couldn't stick to a decision during the pandemic. And Brenda Campbell highlighted that his propensity to flip-flop was actually reflected in his own evidence. Under questioning from, I think it was Hugo Keith, he was mentioning that he had an open mind to the Civil Contingencies Act and that he would defer to his colleagues. And that's cross-referenced with how he quite trenchantly in his written statement was advocating for the Civil Contingencies Act on a pan-UK basis. So it gives a real insight into him. And I thought that was an interesting point.
Yes. And Sammie, Mr. Metzer, who gave the closing submissions for the long COVID groups, you were actually quoted in his closing submission. And it was just very moving hearing him talk about how the people with long COVID were disbelieved and dismissed and ignored. and just wonder what you thought of his submission.
I think that our Casey did an amazing job trying to summarise the experiences of 1.9 million people in a very, very short, I think it was like 15 minutes. It was powerful to hear all of the evidence summarised in that way. I feel like we have really made a lot of ground in this module to try and represent long COVID and the injury that it is to those of us that have been affected, and to evidence that, that they had the information early on and that they chose not to share it. So for listening to Anthony Metzer was incredibly, I can't even think of the right word. It was just all consuming, because we've waited so long to be believed. And, it's been difficult to get that recognition about what's happened to us. And I think that he did a really good job.
Yeah, Sammie, I've learned a lot about long COVID from your group since this module started, especially. And long COVID was always really well represented with members of your group there, and many who are suffering really badly with long COVID. So it was physically a struggle to be there, and I'm just full of admiration to how you all managed to be such a strong presence. And Sam, you gave the closing submissions for the TUC, and again touched a lot on the lack of focus on safety for those who were attending work. It was just really great to see you. I wondered if you wanted to talk about what that was.
It was an enjoyable day in a sense, particularly given what had happened a couple of days previously with Rishi Sunak. There's observations made earlier in our discussion about, can't remember the phrase used precisely, but Rishi Sunak's evidence being a bit of a damn squib full of non-answers. So it was a relief for that to be replaced by some very powerful analysis of, on the part of various groups of the pretty damning evidence that has been heard.
Amos, I just wanted to come to a fellow bereaved. How did you feel seeing Anna Morris just lay everything out so clearly and concisely? It was incredibly useful, I think, as a précis of what we've all been through these last few weeks.
It was inaccurate. I mean, she's, there are 7,000 members or so of the group, aren't there? So for her to satisfy everyone, and everyone who I've spoken to since has agreed with, the way it was. And I emailed Nicola actually the night before saying, 25 minutes, are you having a laugh, basically? It's just insane. You could do a longer speech on a shoplifting trial. I think I actually said that, but she did it so well and so powerfully it was really, really impressive. And as you say, it was quite nice that whereas sort of some of the questions she'd been trying to stop people in awkward places, in these speeches, she couldn't really, could she? So it was a chance to just say, no, look, Baroness Hallett, you listen to us now. We've listened to you and these cabinet ministers for the last few weeks. It felt like, we're here again. And, was when she was saying at the consultation period, bereaved families will be front and center, as you said, Lorelei, it's not felt like that. And in fact, we've been to the right, to the left, to the right and in a pen, haven't we, rather than the front and center, literally outside. So.
Yeah, you're right. Having always been able to be up at the entrance with our dignified, as Lady Hallett called them, vigils with pictures of our loved ones, increasingly through this module, we found ourselves shoved back behind, we called it the pig pen, behind barriers, pushed further and further back. You're right, Amos.
Yeah, I mean, it felt like we were being sort of kettled, really, didn't it? We were just in this tiny area when there was a lot of space around. I mean, as you say, everyone had been so dignified and peaceful throughout. It just didn't seem necessary to us. So it was good to see, and I thought all the speeches, as you say, from the core participants, and the contrast between them and the governments, again, the Cabinet Office, just showing no insight, and the Treasury, it was just, it was good to see.
Well, that's actually what I'd like to move on next, because there was some, the second day, which, full disclosure, because I've been traveling, I had to catch up by reading the transcript, and it was just amazing. So maybe particularly the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. And I wonder if we could talk about the Treasury's thing. I think, the one thing that struck me reading their testimony was their defense of eat out to help out, and minimizing it, saying it was, I think, Enda, you may have mentioned this, someone did, about how it was small, it was a novel and eye-catching measure, it only ran 13 days, it was never meant to go on, even though I think we've seen WhatsApp evidence that maybe that's not true. Nicola, what did you make of the Treasury statement?
Again, in one word, dull, but that's quite rude. So I think the thing to comment about him was he was given 20 minutes. And yet he was allowed to use up 27 and a half minutes, almost 28 minutes. And yet the Scottish ministers were cut very short, and it was basically, they got to 21 in, and it was a case of, no, time's up, move on. The other thing about the Treasury is, as you've said, trying to minimize their role. They said they categorically reject any allegation that they were known as the pro-death team, or that is indeed how they approached things, and that their entire aim was to protect the NHS, and that the best way to do that was through these kinds of schemes, which just didn't make any sense whatsoever. If you want to protect people, you don't pay them to go out, you pay them to stay at home, which is what Sam's team has been fighting for, to pay people who cannot afford to take time off work if they need to self-isolate, pay them so that they don't feel forced to make that terrible decision and go into work anyway and put their colleagues or customers at risk. And we have this terrible dichotomy here with Rishi Sunak and HMT saying there was this entire month between when I announced Eat Out to help out and it actually coming into force. This really long period of an entire month, anyone could have said anything to me during that time. And that's a real contrast with the evidence that Danny Friedman was referring to. So Danny Friedman KC made a closing speech on behalf of the Disability Rights Organisation. And again, one word for his, well, it might be two. His closing speech was barnstorming. I wanted to get up and clap at the end. It felt like a real call to arms. And he said the risk of COVID to disabled people was so obvious. They were obvious to everyone, but the responsibility of no one. And he pointed out that as early as June 2020, it was noticed that people with Down syndrome were particularly at risk of COVID. By the 1st of October, a letter was written saying we need to get Down syndrome people on the list of clinically vulnerable. It takes them a month to actually get Down syndrome people onto this list. Of course, by now, a month has gone from being this terribly long period where loads of things could have been done if only the scientists had bothered to go to Rishi Sunak, if you're in Rishi Sunak's head, to now this month being very, very short. And actually that's a very quick turnaround from receiving a letter to getting them added onto a list. And it's just this elasticity of time, which has a month, which has the exact same number of days, but depending on who you are, that's either a really long time in which loads could have been done, or a really short time in which aren't we fabulous for having achieved this.
And what were the highlights of the Treasury's closing submission for you?
There weren't too many highlights, to be honest. One of the interesting points about the contrast between the likes of the Treasury and the Cabinet's closings, obviously they're going to be self-serving, and that's largely predictable. What was quite different was the devolved administration's closings, because there was a rare sense of unanimity between each of those, which was quite a departure from the Treasury and the Cabinet Office. They were all essentially in agreement that the devolved administrations were being handled and sort of an afterthought in decision making. They agreed that there wasn't sufficient flexibility to allow for local responses. So in what I suspect will be somewhat of a rarity, we were largely agreeing with what the Northern Ireland executive were saying in their closing.
Yeah, and I agree. I forgot to say earlier, one thing I found interesting about the devolved nations and how they were handled, as you just said, was Westminster seemed much more concerned about the optics. And I think your Casey pointed that out. All they cared was what mattered optically and not about genuine engagement or involvement of the devolved administrations.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was laid bare really any time that divergence in approach was mentioned. So probably the nation who took the most divergent approach was Scotland. And divergence in the type of response you took or your public messaging was seen by central government as being political, party politics, cynical. No one really acknowledged that perhaps sometimes a local response is necessary and they're good epidemiological and, in the case of Northern Ireland, geographical reasons, given that we're a different epidemiological unit to the rest of the UK. So that was very interesting, and I think telling that all the DAs were in agreement on that point.
Yeah, moving on to the Cabinet Office, I wanted to ask Amos something. One thing that struck me about that was when they said the government's response evolved over time as the virus was better understood and more tools were developed to combat it, and as lessons were learned. I think for the bereaved, it's this. I think our members who lost their loved ones in the second wave would disagree with that, don't you think, Amos?
Absolutely. I mean, I remember my gran died in April 2020 in a care home, and then as we were watching, Eat Out to Help Out and everything, then my mum caught COVID in December 2020 and ended up in hospital. And we thought we were going to lose her as well. The paramedics came out three times before they took her in eventually. And she's okay now. But, like you say, the lack of any sort of, they just won't accept any responsibility at all. And I mean, the sciences it was also depressing hearing from the Office for Sciences, because even they were sort of saying, no, SAGE there's nothing wrong with the composition of SAGE, the constitution of SAGE. The decisions were okay, and maybe it could have been earlier on the 23rd of March in the first wave, I think they said. As you said, no insight at all really and no sort of real desire to learn from the mistakes that have been made.
They said something else, and I wonder if any of our lawyers wanted to talk about this. They said they stressed this unprecedented number of documents that they had, but they failed to mention, I don't know, it seems like a million years ago now, taking the inquiry to court to stop providing some of these documents. I haven't remembered that wrong, have I? Do any of our lawyers want to comment on that?
It's just self-serving, isn't it? Because they have provided a lot of documents and they've hated every second of it. And they have, done it against their will, frankly. So, it's handy for them to now claim that it was some great act of candor, but everyone knows that it wasn't. And that's all there is to it, as far as I can see.
I know it's all this rewriting, I think, of history that is going on in the submissions. I was interested to see, they talked about things they put in place in 2022, like a resilience framework and a program called A Better Workplace. I guess this came out of the misogyny and crudeness of language in the WhatsApps. Have I read that right? Are these things that are actually happening now? Nicola, what about those programs?
Well, I think any workplace that needs to have a guide on how to not swear to your colleagues and treat them with disrespect, that's problematic. But yeah, what the barrister said at the start was documents that would not normally be disclosed for many years have been made available to the inquiry. As such, this module represents an unprecedented moment of transparency. But why have that culture of secrecy to begin with? What is it that you are hiding? What is it that you are trying to protect? That you are now saying, aren't we fabulous for sharing all of this? And as you alluded to, yes, there was a judicial review that was brought when the chair issued a Section 21 notice and the Cabinet Office said, we cannot comply with that, and came up with wholly inadequate reasons as to why they couldn't comply with it. Essentially, they wanted to be the arbiters of what was relevant to the inquiry and said that they should not have to disclose documents which contained obviously irrelevant documents. That's not a legal test. There's no criteria for it. The chair gets to decide what's relevant to her terms of reference. If she asks for a document, you have to provide it. And if it turns out to contain partially relevant material, that gets disclosed to the CPs. If there is a good reason, documents will be redacted, and that happens all the time. But the relevant material has to be disclosed. And so to claim that they've come to this inquiry with open arms and openness about the documents, it's just not true.
Well, I've got you here, and about that, on the first day of closing submissions, Hugo Keith dealt with some procedural matters, and which meant, if I've understood, that the only documents that can be referred to in the written closing submissions are those that have been published. Is that not a good thing? Is it going to hamper any of you? Again, I'll come to our lawyers for this.
We have made submissions to the inquiry in which we've provided a whole load of references for documents and page numbers and paragraphs that we say should be published. They have come back to us with an updated list of documents that they agree to publish. What they haven't done is come back to us and say, we don't agree with you about those documents, about why we're not going to publish them. So we've got nothing to go up against and say, well, your reasoning is wrong for that, or you've misunderstood our rationale here. We're just kind of left blind at the moment. So we have another opportunity to go back to the inquiry in January and resubmit our lists about which documents are really important and that we think should be in the public domain. But it's being made more difficult than it should be, in my view.
Sam, can I ask you just explain to like our members who may not fully understand? I know Baroness Hellett said that she listened to the closing submission. She said she'll also be taking written submissions. What is that process? How does that work?
Yeah, so all of the core participants have an opportunity to file written submissions by, I think it's the 15th of January. So it's an opportunity to offer some more forensic detail, really, than is possible in 20 minutes or so of oral closing submissions. So they are important, and to a significant degree, I imagine the chair will have reference to sort of written submissions with their detailed references rather than the sort of headline points of oral submissions. On the point of release of documents, it's perfectly standard for an inquiry not to release all documents. And at one view, a sort of dump of thousands of documents, many of which aren't of huge interest, probably wouldn't serve the public interest anyway. But the devil really will be in the detail of what further documents the inquiry are prepared to release. And perhaps the most striking example of that is Sir Patrick Vallance's diaries. And whether they'll be willing to release pages of that diary that haven't been referred to in open evidence, and only a very small proportion of them have. I'm slightly sceptical as to how far they'll go on that, but we'll see.
And we're not, now that we're heading toward the end, save the written submissions of Module 2, we're not CPs in the next 3 modules, which are with the devolved nations. What are you expecting? I think in Northern Ireland, yours is in April.
Yes, so Module 2C is next up for us. Obviously, before that, there's 2A in Scotland and 2B in Wales. Essentially just the equivalent to Module 2 with a focus on the devolved leadership. The big difficulty that we have there is that it's such an important module for our clients. We have a much shorter period of time to look at an incredible amount of detail. We've got 3 weeks of hearings, which on the basis of what they've done so far with 4 days of hearing per week, that's 12 days to cram in an awful lot. That poses logistical difficulties in that there's an awful lot of witnesses to hear from firstly. There's an awful lot of disclosure to get to. But also we've been told throughout Module 2 by the inquiry team that several of the issues we have sought to have addressed throughout Module 2 hearings will be more appropriately a matter for Module 2C. So we do intend to hold them to that, but that will mean that there'll be a significant amount of work to get what we want out of those 12 days of hearing.
Just a note about that, Nicola. I know this must be very frustrating for our team who are participants in this, not able to hear the Northern Ireland testimony.
Yeah, it's very frustrating. There were 2 preliminary hearings this week, one for Wales and one for Northern Ireland. The Scottish preliminary hearing was held a few weeks ago. So I went along to both of those just so I could take a note and update our clients who live in Wales and Northern Ireland, because they're in our group, they're not in one of the other groups that is a core participant. So the only way of staying updated is either to watch it themselves and try to figure out what certain things mean. But that's our job. So it's incredibly disheartening that we haven't got CP status in those modules. But I'm just going to have to try and stay on top of it. The hearings will be live streamed so people can stay updated in the same way. And I just feel duty bound to make sure that I'm also staying updated by watching it myself in real time, so that if any client does have a question, I'll be on hand and hopefully able to answer any questions they may have.
Thank you, Nicola. I just wonder now if I could ask you each maybe for your standout moment or standout witness or whatever throughout this module 2. Amos.
I think for me, it was Boris Johnson, actually. I mean, primarily because I was in the room and, I'd come down for that. I was fortunate enough to be able to go. But I think it was when those WhatsApps were read out about all the comments that he'd made, and he just sat there shaking his head, talking about people having a good innings and that sort of thing. And, they were awful comments, and there was just nothing he could think of really to say it. And he didn't, he wasn't saying I didn't say it. He just didn't know what to do. And I think, it hurt a lot, but at the same token, it just felt like, he had to listen to them.
I agree. That was incredibly chilling. Sam, what were some of your standout moments for you?
Well, as a standout moment, I mean, I couldn't agree more with Amos. I mean, it was in the room. You could feel how important a moment it was. I mean, I would share, if I may, a standout concern, which is that I hope the inquiry in its report really grapples with the response to the second wave, because it just seems to me that there has been such a focus on the movements towards the first lockdown. But it seems to me that in terms of learning lessons for a future pandemic, I'm not convinced that there are vast numbers of lessons in relation to the movement towards the first lockdown, because one of the sort of big challenges, whether it's justified or not, but one of the big challenges was it appeared to be difficult for some to think the unthinkable. That's no longer the problem, and is not going to be the problem for the next 2, 3, 4 decades. But what I think is hugely difficult is that once you take your first action after a first wave, often, and Chris Whitty, to be fair to him, was saying this right from February 2020, once you take your first action, there is then going to be a long period of time before either the virus runs out of steam or a vaccine's developed, or however you sort of move out of the pandemic, where there's this hugely difficult balance between health and the economy and all of the other considerations. And it seems to me that I'm worried that the inquiry hasn't quite grappled with that as it needs to have done. And I'm worried that the lessons aren't going to be learned as they need to be.
Thank you for saying that, Sam. And I have to say that I do see this on a lot of the chat boards, a lot of concern that enough attention wasn't paid about that period of potential learning. And as Amos and I said, those of us who lost people in the first wave are so frustrated that the deaths of our loved ones couldn't even help people, not so many people, to die in that second wave. Sammie, what was your standout?
So 2 actually. One was Chris Breitling and Rachel Evans, who were the witnesses on long COVID, and for the people who have been injured by the virus, particularly those of us in the first wave, who have fought so hard to be believed and experienced medical gaslighting and refusal of medical care for disbelief of our symptoms. Just having that validation and hearing them say very clearly that long COVID is a real, very severe, or can be very severe, complex disease, and that the information was available from early on to assist decision making was validating, but also harrowing. But to know that the information had been there and ignored. And then secondly, to hear Rishi Sunak say that, lessons have been learned and we know so much more about the virus now, and yet I can't think of a single thing that's changed to reduce ongoing risk of death and of injury. And that to me was chilling, because if lessons have been learnt, why is there no action? And why is the pandemic always discussed in the past tense when we know that it's just now due to lack of interest and recording and data sharing that we don't know actually what's going on? But what we do know is that friends and family all around us right now are dropping like flies with COVID and reinfections. Children have been sick at school. We've got new members joining our support services who have been recently infected and now developing long COVID, or developing long COVID from reinfection. So I wonder, really, have lessons been learned, and at what point will they actually start acting on them if they have?
Thank you, Sammie. And Enda, I have to thank you. You've been a participant so often in Module 1 and Module 2, and I'm always just so grateful for your participation and your commentary. I wonder what your standout moments were for this module.
Thank you, Lorelei. My standout moments really tie two moments together, one at the beginning of Module 2 and one at the end. The first one was the evidence of Katrina Miles on behalf of the Northern Ireland bereaved families. I mean, she spoke so passionately and articulately about the heartbreaking story in relation to her father, Gerard, who died in December 2020. And then you come full circle to week 8 when Brenda Campbell is questioning Boris Johnson, and she puts parts of that story to him, and particularly the fact that while Katrina's family were going through that turmoil, there was a party in Downing Street, and did he understand that compounded the grief of the bereaved? And while he said he did, I think his face told an entirely different story. So that was my highlight. And the other point is that to see Boris Johnson, who obviously set up the inquiry, a former Prime Minister and the current Prime Minister, give evidence in an inquiry is an incredible achievement for the bereaved, who this wouldn't have happened if not for their efforts. So it's a real moment in history that they can be incredibly proud of.
Thank you for that, Enda. And Nicola, last but never least, what about you?
I'm going to push my luck and ask for 3. So my witness of Module 2 is Angela McLean, one of the scientists. She was outstanding. We think that it was her who named Rishi Sunak Dr. Death, so she clearly had his number. She also, when the chair tried to insult her work and say her report wasn't particularly electrifying, so quick-witted, she retorted, "Yes, but you don't even like graphs." And that was a real moment for her, I think. My biggest disappointment was that Boris Johnson was allowed to give a speech at the end of his testimony, a speech in which he insulted the terms of reference of this inquiry that he set up for not looking into the origin of COVID. And yet when one of our co-founders, Joanna Goodman, tried to give evidence at the start, she was constantly stopped and not given the freedom to speak. And I think I just want to end with the words of Rajiv Menon Casey, actually, who made a closing submission on behalf of children's rights organisations, because I think he neatly sums up what we've been facing. He said, "The evidence of the key political decision makers, Michael Gove, Matt Hancock, Boris Johnson and Rishi Sunak, was telling. lots of smoke and mirrors, lots of diplomatic non-answers, lots of blaming others, lots of I cannot remember. We say all four were unconvincing. They gave insincere apologies. They were primarily interested in defending their own reputations. They were quick, even when admitting a mistake, to fall back on an excuse or qualification that sought to deflect responsibility onto the scientists, or to suggest it's easy to be wise after the fact. It was all so unsatisfactory. It was the barrel that was rotten, not just the odd apple.
Thank you, Nicola. I think that's a really good thing to end on. And Nicola, I just wanted to say that despite being our lead solicitor, which is a tremendous workload for you, you still make the time to do this podcast, which is so appreciated by our members. So I really want to thank you. And I look forward to working with you in the next module, which I believe is module 4, vaccinations. And thank you to all of you here. Thank you so much for participating. I'm so grateful. And I hope to see you soon.
Thanks for listening to this instalment of the COVID Inquiry podcast. We hope you found it insightful and interesting. If you did, please rate us on the podcast platform you use and share the pod with friends and family who may value this type of commentary. We're looking forward to you joining us next week for more expert commentary, opinion, and insight into the COVID Inquiry evidential hearings.